Hear ye, hear ye. Okay, hear ye, hear ye. Hey, this is, I was a little panicked about the circumstances, not having the library, but this is working out really well, and there's free beer and free pizza as well.
Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, there's the pizza.
Will, you can't have any.
Okay. No, you still disciplined me.
Yeah, still, yeah.
30 years ago.
For years.
Did you read the whole pizza back then?
Probably.
I didn't want to miss this lecture because there's so much going on, and the alternative was to wait till the 28th of January, and I was just thinking we might not even have a world by January 28th.
Really?
So we better have this as quick as possible.
Right.
It's really scary. As I always try to do is to kind of blend current developments with historical background and context, and I always feel that combined can give us some idea of where we're headed, okay? Although we certainly don't have a crystal ball, but we do know that there are certain social processes underway, and there's a certain trajectory with those processes. And so what I hope to do today is to provide a sketch of the current state of things, and then kind of go into some kind of conceptual and maybe even theoretical framework to understand why we are where we're at. And out of that, maybe we can get some idea of where we might be headed. And certainly we hope to, well, we don't hope, we plan to have a Q&A and obviously comments from the masses here, okay? So we'll try to go through this, not quickly, but to try to only go for about 45 minutes or maybe an hour to present this. The first thing I want to do is to kind of sketch out the events. This is very bare bones. There's enormous detail in everything I'm going to say. But I think most of you guys are aware of these events and have opinions and strong emotional feelings about what's going on as well. I think in general, from my vantage point, there are three wars going on globally right now at various stages. One is Ukraine. And obviously, up until October 7th, the world focused on that war. Since October 7th, it's been the Israeli genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza, as well as the ongoing ethnic cleansing in the West Bank as well. The other war is the possible war between the United States and China. And what we're going to comment on is there were some developments even yesterday in Taiwan over the election in Taiwan. There were three parties that were contending for the presidency and control of the parliament. And the ruling party, the Democratic Progressive Party, with a new candidate, won that election. And that party has been committed to closer relations with the United States, which only adds to increased tension in Taiwan, tension between Taiwan and China. And obviously, from the American point of view, it's exactly what they want, because I think for the previous comments or lectures we've given, I personally think is the U.S. is trying to use Taiwan just like it used Ukraine to provoke a war with Russia. So I think those are the three areas that we're really concerned about. Now, related to Gaza, the horrific elements or aspects are obviously the genocide. The numbers of people have been killed, 24,000, apparently another 8,000 or 9,000 that are missing, some 70,000 people that have been wounded, amputees, young people. It's enormous. But along with the deaths and the wounded, what I've been thinking about a lot is some 500,000 or more that are starving to death because the Israelis have prevented food and water, medicine going into the country or into Gaza. And it's been 3 months now, and it's how long then can people survive not having food? So that is a major concern. And as you know, some 85% of the country has been displaced of the population in areas where Israel continues to bomb, although in the last few days, owing to these events in The Hague, the Israelis have come out and with all kinds of propaganda saying we're dropping leaflets to warn them and all kinds of stuff that just doesn't stick in my mind. And I don't think anyone here would agree with that. And along with that is the obvious aspect is that the Biden administration, and I would argue the United States, is joined at the hip with Israel and continues to provide cover for Israel diplomatically, politically, as well as aiding Israel with arms, ammunition, etc., on a daily basis. One of the, to be honest with you, it's really hard to follow some of this stuff in the sense that the Biden and Blinken and all of these jokers are running around saying, we don't want a wider war, we don't want a wider war, while they're refusing to push for a ceasefire, which they could get in a day if they really wanted it. They continue to provide weapons to Israel, and they, in the last few days, have been bombing Yemen, okay? Although they claim they don't want a wider war. So my view there very strongly is this is being done to try to provoke Iran into some kind of action to cause a real war in the region that will be catastrophic, to say the least. Personally, I don't think Iran would like to go to war at this point, but circumstances, who knows, may dictate that happening. There are a few upsides to the story. The events in The Hague in the last few days have been fascinating to watch. They are of historical significance. This is the first time Israel has ever had to go to the docket, if you will, to face international criticism from a legitimate point of view. Many of you have probably read all or part of the South African application charging Israel with genocide. It's a devastating document, to say the least, and it's impossible to believe that any court of law would not rule genocide. But to quote Norman Finkelstein in the last few days, he's not assured that the court will rule genocide because of the politics involved. And so we will watch that. We all will be watching that very, very closely. To kind of comment on more of to make kind of a concluding statement, I've been thinking very strongly, and the sources I listen to and read have kind of confirmed my thoughts here, and that is that if the court does rule in favor of the South African application, that is going to be of significance in labeling not only South Africa, Israel, but also the United States with the label of genocide as well. But if the court does not rule genocide, that's also going to be positive as well. Because I'm also, as a political activist, historically, not only as an academic, I'm always concerned about political education and radicalization. And so I think what we're watching as a sidebar on a global level within the global civil society is an enormous educational process that's going on in the world, pointing out the realities of power, and maybe more specifically imperialism and how imperialism operates globally. So personally, I'm not, I feel there's a win-win regardless of what the court does. We'll make some comments on this in a while. The other upside is the ongoing demonstrations on a global level in favor of the Palestinians within what I like to call the global civil society. That kind of goes hand in hand with the radical education that's going on, I think, globally. Domestically related to Israel and Gaza, some things that aren't surprising, but are obviously very troubling at the same time. On one level, what we have is a new, extremely virulent form of McCarthyism that's going on in this country from the top all the way through various institutions, academic institutions and the like. I think all of you have been following elements of this, and that is to anyone who is critical of Israel and supports Palestine is anti-Semitic, and people's not only are people losing their jobs and being targeted, but what to me is even more sinister, partly because I lived through all of this teaching at Chico State, particularly events around 9/11 back in 2001, and many here might remember that story, is how the institutions themselves self-censor themselves and not allow certain points of view to be discussed, not only in the classroom, but also in the public, in the actual free speech forums that campuses have. I don't want to sound too egotistical here, but personally, in a private sense, we're all among friends here. I'm kind of disgusted that I haven't been invited to speak on the campus, particularly owing to my some 36 years of living on that campus. But I don't think they want to hear what I have to say. Although on the other hand, I feel very honored to be involved in public forums in the community, which I think are very, very important as well. Continuing on the domestic level, the focus obviously is the presidential election, and a few general comments about that. As I've said, the first talk I gave in November, I think the Democrats and Biden are committing political suicide in supporting Israel unquestionably. And regardless of the mealy-mouthed rhetoric that comes out of the Biden administration, that they're doing all that they can to minimize dangers to people in Gaza is absolutely bullshit. Okay, I mean, it can't be taken seriously, to say the least. And and also it's too late. I mean, if they change their tune a week after October 7th, it might be different. But we're not going to forget what they're doing. Now, what does that mean related to the election? Biden's in trouble, I think. On the other hand, as for the Republicans, Trump is promising revenge and vindication while running a campaign that's lifted from Adolf Hitler's playbook, by the way, which also leads a bigger question is some kind of analysis as to where the United States is domestically on a political, social level. I have some comments at the very end of my presentation to talk about that. Related to the other war, and that is Ukraine, we still follow Ukraine very, very closely. And I think what most reasonable people that have been following events in Ukraine understand is that there is no way that the U.S. proxy war is going to prevail. Russia is winning the war, whatever that means, and will determine the outcome of what happens in Ukraine. The tragedy of that, obviously, is there were many opportunities for a political solution before February 24th, 2022. but the United States consciously refused to negotiate in good faith the Minsk II Accords, and certainly ignored the December 17th, 2021 letter that Putin sent to the United States to discuss finding some political alternative to the crisis that the Russians felt owing to NATO enlargement and the use of Ukraine militarily to provoke this war. More significantly related to Ukraine, the real objective, I believe very strongly, of the United States vis-a-vis Ukraine was to provoke the war and to create, to be able to implement sanctions in the effort to try to break the Russian political economy, therefore would cause conditions for a coup d'etat, the overthrow of Putin, and the institution of some regime quite similar to Boris Yeltsin regime in the 1990s, where Yeltsin was basically a client of the United States at that point. The ballgame changed in 1999 when Putin became president of the country. That's a long history in and of itself. So the U.S., regardless of what happens in Ukraine, the U.S. has failed in its objectives vis-a-vis Russia. And in fact, Russia is much stronger, qualitatively stronger on economic, military, and diplomatic levels than it was prior to February 24th. We're going to talk about U.S. failures in its projects in a while. And then, as I noted earlier about Taiwan, the elections are also another aspect of all of this. Now, so that's generally just a rough outline of current events that I think are relevant. The second area of discussion are raising some questions, and that is, are these developments separate or are they connected in any way? Two, how could one make sense of all of the above? And three, where is this all heading? So those are some of the questions I'd like to try to address in my remarks. First, these separate wars are not local, they're not just local wars with specific histories. They're all interconnected. And they're interconnected, as I'm going to explain in a few minutes, related to a U.S. project in its pursuit of global absolute hegemony. And we'll sketch that out in a moment. What I also want to say is, though the kind of World War III that we've envisioned all of my life, that World War III was going to be nuclear holocaust, we're not there yet, okay? Hopefully we won't ever get there. But what I want to say is I strongly believe that we are in World War III, okay? This is it, okay? And I'm going to try to explain to you why I feel that way. What is happening now is more, in an outline form, more like the near 100-year war in the 17th and 18th century between France and England over control of the world system, where there were these regional wars that were constant. The obvious difference is France and England did not have nuclear weapons at the time, so that makes the analogy qualified, to say the least. The second point why I can say we're in the middle of World War III is the sides of the conflict are set in stone, okay? We know the sides, and more what Gaza has taught us is what those sides are. There's no debate on this. One side is the United States, which calls the shots, okay? The United Kingdom, the EU, with Germany playing the pivotal role in that story, as well as NATO, and Israel, okay? But they also have to be joined with Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea, okay? Now, how do you describe that grouping, okay? The US, the Biden administration, calls them the democracies, okay? Which is obviously a euphemism for neoliberal capitalism, okay? To be very candid with you. They could be called the West. They could be called the G7. Vladimir Putin calls it the collective West. And I just call it the imperialist bloc, okay? The traditional historical imperialist bloc that has been existent since the 15th century, and certainly in its modern form in the late 1900s, or 1800s, excuse me. Now, these entities, these political entities led by the United States, the policies that come out of this arrangement are policies that are articulated and defined and implemented by the foreign policy establishment as well as the political establishment in these societies, who are basically working in the interests of the respective ruling classes, meaning the capitalist classes in these societies. And at this point in history for the United States, the dominant capitalist entity or sector is Wall Street, okay? And the financial sector of the economy. What we want to stress very strongly is that the people in those societies don't have any say as to the policies, although on one side of the coin, most people are effectively brainwashed by the corporate-owned media. I can give you a current example of that just, I don't know, just sometimes it's hard to keep your sanity in watching this, but I've spent time a couple days ago watching the mainstream media's report of the bombing of Yemen. And not once did the PBS NewsHour or Amirpour and Company or Washington Week in Review and the several other sources I watch mention that the Houthis were stopping specific ships in the Bab el-Mandab that were headed to Israel. And they were allowing ships that were not going to Israel to go through that passageway or that strait. Secondly, the Houthis had said, we will stop when there is a ceasefire, okay? How they presented the material is these people were madmen and that they were stopping every ship, et cetera, et cetera. So if I'm an average American citizen watching this, I'm going to walk away with a particular interpretation that is not accurate, okay? But this is just one tiny example that we've been watching for as long as I've been politically conscious, which has been a long time, that how they operate, okay? So most people are brainwashed effectively or socialized or propagandized or whatever. But at the same time, on the other side of the coin, people didn't figure the Ukraine war out at all, but people in the civil societies in these respective countries have figured out the Gaza story very much. And so if you look at the polls and the opinions and all of this, that increasingly more and more people are opposed to what Biden or the United States is doing. Certainly, as they presented groupings between 18 and 34, some 80% are supporting the Palestinian position on all of this. So there is optimism on that level. Now, what's the other side of this war? Well, the other side can be conceptualized as a congealing of nations that are committed to a multipolar world order, okay? In contrast to the United States committed to a unipolar world order dominated by the United States. There are also groups that are active, involved in resisting the U.S. unipolar strategies as well. So in some way it's a specific grouping, but in other ways it's a congealing, amorphous group that is rather fluid at this stage. But what we can characterize is a few entities that exist: China, Russia, Iran, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS Plus. Let's see what else we have here. The Global South, okay, which we used to affectionately call the Third World, by the way. I'm still having problems with the Global South, okay? And obviously the axis of resistance. You guys know who the axis of resistance are? They're Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis or the Ansar Allah, as well as Iran, who have been fighting against Israeli and U.S. Policies in the last 15 to 20 years, to say the least. We have, how should I say, I don't want to make this a big issue. The reality is most of those groups are not secular, and there's a reason for that, partly because imperialism has been fostering jihadist interests to fight and undermine and divide secular nationalist movements in the Middle East for many, many decades now, and that's what we've gotten to in this point. But even though they may be jihadists or Islamicists or whatever, I'm on their side in this war, to be very clear. And once we get rid of imperialism, then we'll sit down and discuss what kind of political system we're going to have, okay? And I'm being metaphorical there, or hypothetical there, to say the least. So what my second point was is the sides of this war are fairly well defined. There are countries that are playing both sides against the middle. Turkey would be an example. India would be an example. Saudi Arabia is playing both sides of the middle in many ways. But I think they're also increasingly putting their finger up to test which way the wind is blowing, okay? And one of the points that is very, very important here is, why can this exist? Well, it can exist because of China, okay? Because of China. China provides an alternative economically related to development to countries in the global south, and they can take chances and resist the United States. So this is part of a historical process that is very, very significant. Now, what is being fought over? What is being fought over? I think I've already kind of alluded to what the prize, if you will, what the prize is. On one side, the U.S. is fighting for a unipolar world order based on democratization, which is also, again, as I said, a euphemism for capitalism. Now, underneath that is some kind of support for elections. But if you notice around the world, when these elections are held, and the party that the United States doesn't like, what does the United States do? It begins to immediately demonize the leader or the party. It begins to put sanctions on the country, and then it targets the country for destabilization and regime change, okay? So when they're talking about they're promoting democratization, I don't believe them, okay? Because to me, democracy is supposed to be about the consent of the government and govern, and they determine what policies they want. And if it goes against the United States, so be it. They have that right, okay? But that's not what democratization means on the part of the United States. The second thing that's part of the world order is neoliberalism. And I think everybody in the room knows what neoliberalism is. It's a stage of capitalism that is committed to smashing the public sector, privatizing the public sector, eliminating taxes for the wealthy, eliminating regulations on everything from environmental protections down the line, breaking organized labor, et cetera, et cetera. So neoliberal agendas are part of this. As thirdly is permanent war, and then fourthly is a commitment to the rules-based international order, which is not international law, it's what the U.S. says law should be. And the three elements of the U.S.'s rules-based order is a support for democratization, and I've already debunked that. Secondly, a commitment to human rights. And thirdly, again, a rules-based order. But related to U.S.'s position with Israel and Palestinians, the U.S. can no longer going around saying it's a champion of human rights and democracy and a rules-based order. So that's being blown out of the water. Now, what is the multipolar world order? What's its agenda? We could examine each nation state or each non-state actor and come up with all kinds of different views. But I think if you distill all of what's going on, it's a commitment to national sovereignty, which the United States does not respect. It's a commitment to respect for national interests. Russia believes that it has a right to have a buffer state from a sphere of influence and a buffer from Western imperialist aggression. Okay, it's willing to negotiate. It was willing to negotiate a way to deal with that, with a revision of NATO, if you will, and other security arrangements. The U.S. has that. We have the Monroe Doctrine. You know, you're not going to see Chinese military vessels off the coast of San Francisco, okay? It ain't going to happen, okay? Why can we sail within Chinese territorial waters and it's okay, and they can't? You see what I'm saying here? There's a double standard here that is being pointed out very, very directly by the interests that we're talking about. The third element of the rules-based order is political negotiations and compromise, okay? Fourthly, it's international cooperation through a range of different kind of multilateral organizations. Certainly the United Nations would be on that list. Fair trade is on that, and something called win-win development, which is basically the position of the Chinese related to its development policies. Let's see where else we should say. Now, related to what underscores anything that I'm presenting, is historical, excuse me one second. Oh man, was that too much wine last night? But it's historical process. Things are moving, okay? Things are not static. So when I'm talking about this multipolar world order congealing, if we took a snapshot today and then 6 weeks from now or 2 years from now, it might look a little bit different. Okay, so there's these developments that are happening. The fourth area, and this is where a lot of the meat of my presentation is going to be. Where is the theater of this conflict happening? Where is the war being fought over? Where is the terrain of World War III happening at the moment? I want to add a little bit of methodological information here. Why can I draw these conclusions that I'm about to conclude? Why will I be able to kind of outline what I'm about to say? First of all, I've been following this stuff for a hell of a long time, and I have a political analysis or economic analysis of the world. But also one follows two things on a relatively daily basis, and that's weeding through the current events and the news with a range of different sources. But just as importantly, we read the actual strategic documents that the State Department, the Defense Department, and the National Security Agency put out, okay? These are not top secret, they're available, but they're not necessarily disseminated among the general public. So you can go to the horse's mouth, if you will, and find out what they want to do, okay? It's not top secret, although we're not going to see the mainstream media tell people what these documents say. The classic documents, there are a number of them, but I think two that stand out. One was the 1950 NFC 68 document, which laid out the outlines of the Cold War, and it laid out the objectives of the Cold War, which was regime change against so-called communist government. In a post-Cold War period, and I mentioned one of the talks I gave before, is the Wolfowitz Doctrine of 1992 is the centerpiece of post-Cold War U.S. foreign policy. And then we use deductive logic to try to sort through what's going on here. What I can come up with is that the terrain, the theater of this is Eurasia, okay? And we can start at 1991, if you will, although the history goes further back, and NATO obviously is one of those elements of that history. And so looking at the world from 2024 back to 1991, taking with it what I knew in 91 and knew in 92, 93, et cetera, this is what you can kind of lay out related to what U.S. policy was vis-a-vis Eurasia. Now, we have to stress a couple things. One, we have to introduce Halford Mackinder's the homeland theory, which was concocted, I think, in 1904 by Halford Mackinder, who was a British geographer and an advisor to the British Foreign Office. And he came up with a framework that the British used and the United States has used since 1945, and it's been even more concretized since the end of the Soviet Union. And the Mackinder's homeland theory, and you can go to Google or whatever search engine you use, type in Mackinder or the homeland theory, and basically the premise of it is who controls Eastern Europe controls the heartland, and who controls the heartland controls the world island, and who controls the world island controls the world. What is the heartland? The heartland is Russia, okay? If you control Eastern Europe, i.e. if you control Ukraine, you can control the heartland, you control Russia. If you control the heartland, you control the world island. Well, what is the world island? It's Eurasia and Africa, okay? Which has the bulk of the world's population, almost all of the world's natural resources, and the largest market possible, okay? So that's the general objective. That's what the Mackinder heartland theory tells us, and that is a framework of U.S. foreign policy makers. More specifically, I would encourage you to read a book by Zbigniew Brzezinski, our boy Zbig, published in 1997 called The Grand Chessboard. Brzezinski was a student of Mackinder, and in that book, Brzezinski lays out the framework for U.S. policy vis-a-vis Eurasia. And it's almost like a template that you color by numbers kind of thing, and follow that up to the present. And it's a remarkable document. The second thing, and as I mentioned before, is the 1992 Wolfowitz Doctrine. The formal title is, I think it's Defense Policy Guideline 1994-1999. In that document, there's a simple sentence or several sentences. U.S. foreign policy from 1991 was to prevent the emergence of a peer competitor on the territories that was the former Soviet Union presided, okay? To eliminate a peer competitor, okay? That peer competitor is now China and Russia, okay? And the US tried to prevent that from happening. They have failed, but now they're involved in trying to break those two regimes. And I'm going to argue they're failing at it, okay? Now, the bad part of that, the US isn't going to give up, and that could lead to nuclear war. So far, we're not there yet. So let's walk through the application of, there's one other element too. In 1991, when the Cold War was over, the US, from 45 to 91, the US sat over it was a global hegemon that oversaw a bipolar world order, meaning the Soviet Union and its bloc. When the Soviet Union disintegrates, we now have a unipolar world order, and there were areas now available for the United States that it did not have access to from 1945 to 1991, okay? So, and all of those areas were basically Eurasia, okay? Parts of the Middle East, Iraq, for example, and certainly the former republics, now nation states of the Soviet Union, etc., Afghanistan, etc., etc. So you've got the pursuit of absolute global hegemony, you've got Mackinder and the Homeland Theory, the Heartland Theory, excuse me, and you've got Wolfowitz's doctrine as well. So those provide a framework. Excuse me a second. Since 1992, there have been a number of other strategic documents that have added to U.S. policy as events on the ground begin to change. Perhaps the most important was the 2018 Defense Department strategic guidelines, which defined China as a peer competitor, by the way, okay, updating Wolfowitz by almost 20 years, or more than 20 years, almost 30 years. So let's walk through the major areas of Eurasia and see what policies have been. Related to Europe, to maintain the transatlantic alliance, which is, who did that? Peg, is that you? Shame on you.
I didn't mean to bring my phone.
Shame on you. You got it? Okay. With Europe, to continue the transatlantic alliance, which we could talk about, it's the linkages that exist between the United States and Europe on structural levels, economic levels, banking, arms industries, political think tanks, et cetera, et cetera. They're joined at the hip is what they are. We know about Davos, we know about all of these, the Business Roundtable, Trilateral Commission, all of these structures that link Europe. So if you're wondering why Europe is walking hand in hand with US policy, they are literally vassals to the United States, to say the least. Nevertheless, as vassals, they have had relative independent foreign policies and certainly economic policies. And one of those policies was Europe, particularly Germany, moving in its natural orbit towards the east and linking with Russia in the last 15 or so years related to energy links, meaning Russia providing oil to, or energy sources, natural gas to Europe. What the US was committed to was severing those links, okay? And to prevent Europe from trading and having economic ties with Russia. This is part of forcing Europe to continue to be subordinate to the United States, but also to prevent it from moving towards its natural market, which would be into Europe. And it was also part of isolating and breaking Russia as well. So it is a multi-purpose there. And obviously blowing up Nord Stream 1 and 2 was the implementation of that policy. Now, related to Russia, we've already kind of laid out, there are two phases here. The 90s, where Russia was basically a client of the United States. The US was responsible for privatizing the economy, creating the oligarchs, Naomi Klein, in her book, The Shock Doctrine, has a long section of how the U.S. policies worked towards Russia during the 1990s. There's many other sources as well, but in a limited number of pages, I think Klein's book is very helpful there. And then since Putin's come into power, what's interesting, when Putin came into power, he wanted Russia to be oriented to the West. He wanted trade with the West, and he even talked about, with the United States, of joining NATO, okay? But the US obviously didn't want Russia to be part of NATO because Russia was a powerful country, okay? Had nuclear weapons, etc. And it also had other designs for Russia too. It didn't want it to be a co-equal. It wanted it to be a client or vassal, so they weren't going to allow that. I began to see the demonization of Russia, of Putin, as early as 2003, okay? And this could be documented, okay? And we've seen this constant demonization of Putin in Russia, et cetera, and then in 2016 it amplifies when this faux crisis of Russia meddling in the election, causing Hillary Clinton from losing. I mean, that's absolutely ridiculous. And most of my Democratic friends, I guess I don't have Democratic Party friends anymore, to be honest. Seriously, I don't. I used to. Can't talk to them. And they don't want to talk to me, to be honest with you. And I don't want to talk to them either.
I'm a Democrat. I'm here. I'm a Democrat.
Okay, well, there's one Democrat I want to talk to, okay? Especially drinking beer.
You can't talk to me.
I know, I can. I know that. But,
Thanks for speaking.
and she spoke up for the Democrats here. Well, there are good Democrats and bad Democrats, okay? But that's a topic for another discussion, okay? And then obviously demonization, military encirclement, NATO enlargement up to Russia's border, and even the wars in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, were part of the destabilization of what Spikeman calls the rimland, the area around the heartland, okay? If you can destabilize and control the rimland, then you therefore can isolate and pinch the heartland as well. So this is part of foreign policy doctrine and policy, to say the least. And then since 2022 with I believe it was a defensive move on the part of the Russians and not aggression, by the way, and I think history will prove that, but certainly provided an opportunity for increased sanctions with the design of breaking the economy, regime change, and dismantling Russia like Yugoslavia was dismantled in the 1990s. All of this has not worked so far, just point of information. And then with China, you have a really interesting problem with China in the sense that most of the US's economy is linked to China. You go to Target or you go to Costco or you go to all of these big box stores, etc. Most of the goods you buy were made in China, okay? So you have this engagement, but in that process, China's gotten richer and richer and richer. I mean, if you just look at the economic growth of China from 1990, 2000, 2010, 2020, or the percentage, this is maybe even more interesting, the percentage of Chinese GNP globally in 1990 was 2%, okay? Today it's about 25%, it's estimated to be 28% in 5 years, okay? And at the same time, the US's percentage has precipitously declined as well, okay? So you're engaged with China, but at the same time, China is getting stronger and stronger and stronger. So in the late 90s, Michael Clare, somebody I admire or respect, I don't know if I admire him, but I respect his thinking. He came up with this idea of congagement, and that is you contain China, but you engage it as well. And I would argue to this very day, that's the struggle in the US foreign policy establishment and between the Democrats and the Republicans. To what degree do you contain versus what degree that you engage? I would argue increasingly the ratio is more containment with militarist provocation than engagement, because China is just getting too strong. And we'll talk about why in a minute. Related to, and this is bipartisan, by the way. Don't think one party is better than the other, because under Obama, you had the beginnings of the military containment designed as, remember, pivot to Asia? Pivot to Asia in 2009, okay? There's some 80 military bases surrounding China at this point in time, okay? And then the Middle East, where do you start? In a nutshell, the first objective is to bolster Israel as the regional hegemon, okay? Which continues to this very moment. And what that means is a regime change or destabilization of any secular nationalist government that is independent in the region. Saddam Hussein, al-Bashir in Syria, Gaddafi in Libya, or religious government that's independent, and obviously that's Iran. Okay, and then the second part of the agenda is normalization, and I think we've talked about this before, to induce reactionary or conservative regimes in the region to normalize relations with Israel. And I think we talked about this before in 79, remember Sadat normalized relations with Israel. 94, Jordan normalized relations. Under Jared Kushner's regime, he was able to implement the Abraham Accords, which linked Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Oman, and Morocco into this normalization process. And under Biden, they were negotiating Saudi Arabia up until October 7th, okay? And I would argue that normalization is out the window at this point. Related to the Palestinians, even though it appears there are degradations, and the objective has always been the same: Greater Israel and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. And there are different levels, different processes, etc. But obviously, this war has given Israel the opportunity to ethnically cleanse Gaza, although in the last couple days surrounding the hearings in the International Court of Justice, the Israeli position has been, oh, we don't want to kick them out of Gaza, you know. Well, what else are you trying to do then? I mean, prove it, you know. So anyway, now related to the other element, the other side of the coin is what can be described as Eurasian integration, okay? And this is a counter-hegemonic project that most groups in Eurasia or Asia are involved in, but you could say that China is the driving force in this Eurasian integration. Now, what is very, very, very important, this Eurasian integration at this moment is creating counter-hegemonic alliances and institutions and structures, counter-hegemonic structures, opposed to US-controlled hegemonic structures, okay? The World Bank, the World Trade Organization, NATO, the EU, all those institutions. What is very important is many of these countries that are involved in creating counter-hegemonic institutions wanted to integrate into US institutions, okay? But that would have required reform, restructuring, compromise, negotiations, a loss of United States influence. And obviously US policy has been to isolate and intimidate and destabilize these countries and regimes rather than work with them. The counter-hegemonic project also was committed to political negotiations. Putin wanted negotiations on Ukraine since 2015. He begged the US, he begged the EU, but they didn't want to do it, okay? And even the military special operation that went into Ukraine on February 24th was not designed to take over the country. It was designed to provoke Kiev to go into negotiations. And that is exactly what happened. There were negotiations in Istanbul through early March of 2022. 2022. And there was the document, okay? A political solution. And what happened? Boris Johnson went to Kiev and said, don't sign this, we're going to give you enough arms to win, okay? And Zelensky, I mean, I have strong opinions about what happened, but, there was too much money to be made in taking that money, okay? And here's the rub, they honestly believe, I'm talking about the United States, NATO, and Zelensky, they honestly believed they were going to defeat Russia. They honestly believed it. They didn't call up Napoleon. They didn't call up the Kaiser. They didn't call up Hitler and ask, can you help us? They said, no, don't do it, baby. You ain't going to win, okay? One of my good left-wing friends in San Francisco, we spoke on the phone the other day, and he was strongly critical of Russia, and I kept arguing, it ain't gonna work. They're not gonna overthrow Putin, man. They're not. And we talked on the phone, and he actually, I was amazed. When I said, Steve, what's going on? He said, George, you were right. How did you know? I said, I just study history, man. I just study history, okay? But the point I'm making, the U.S. honestly believed that, okay? That's how the hubris. I mean, the Israelis right now think they're going to get away with this, okay? Israel is going to be a pariah state for the next 100 years, okay? I don't care how many Palestinians lose. Israel is going to lose, okay? They've already lost. They've lost in the court of global public opinion, okay? You understand what I'm saying? History works dialectically. It doesn't work linearly, okay? It's very, very important here, okay? Now, related to the counter-hegemonic project, you have the China-Russia partnership. Remember the Wolfowitz Doctrine says we don't want a peer competitor exist in Eurasia? They've literally pushed China and Russia together. Trump is Trump. Okay, I don't want to say anything, open that bag of wind up. But and he's dangerous. He's dangerous. But Biden's dangerous as well too. Okay, keep that in mind. But one of the things that the only thing Trump said that I thought was cool, let's normalize relations with Russia. They went after him for that, okay? We wouldn't have this war today if they'd normalized relations with Russia, but they didn't want normalization. The ruling class, political establishment, the foreign policy establishment, the Democrats did not want normalization with Russia because they wanted this war. They thought they could overthrow Putin and put in a new Yeltsin. It didn't work. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS Plus, the Eurasian Union, the Asian Infrastructural Development Bank, and the Belt Road Initiative are various elements of this counter-hegemonic Eurasian integration project. If you don't know about these things, you need to study them because this is what all of this is about. Part of this war in Gaza is about China and the Belt Road Initiative, okay? Because what the U.S. has been working with India, with Israel, and with Europeans is to create an alternative corridor called the India, Middle East, Europe corridor to undermine and circumvent the Chinese corridor. But guess where that corridor comes out in? Northern Gaza, okay? It comes out in northern Gaza. So you got to get rid of the Palestinians so you can have this alternative corridor that challenges the Belt Road Initiative. You guys understand what I'm saying? It's all not about just people and Israel and and Jews, and there's economic strategic underpinnings to all of this, okay?
Wow.
Oh, but you're not going to see this on the NewsHour, okay, or CNN or MSNBC, okay? It exists, and that's why I'm thankful we can have this kind of forum here, okay? Let me let's hopefully finish this up, because I'm getting tired here. What do I want to say here? Again, the framework I've provided should help to explain somewhat the state of things that are going on today, specifically Ukraine, Gaza, and the events in the South China Sea. More specifically, and this is a fundamental point, more specifically for the United States, Ukraine and Gaza are not wars of choice. The Iraq war was a war of choice, okay? Because if the war ends, the status quo still basically exists, okay? These wars are existential wars, okay? Because if the U.S. loses, the U.S. loses, okay? It is reduced to a second-rate power or simply a co-equal power in a potentially multipolar world, okay? So the U.S. cannot afford to lose these wars, okay? That's why you're fearful of potentially nuclear war. The Israelis have nuclear weapons. They could use nuclear weapons. Part of why the Iranians don't want to go to war, part of why Nasrallah, the General Secretary of Hezbollah, they really don't want a full-scale war because they know Israel has at least 80 nuclear weapons, and some have estimated as many as 300. And when these people are, when you add the arrogance of the Americans and the arrogance of the Zionists in Israel, and their belief that they're totally immune from consequences, once backed into a corner, they can be dangerous. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
This is our concern. Give me a few more seconds, because I have some brilliant comments here. Okay, let me finish up really quickly. And this is, to me, a major point, and we'll try to wrap this up in a few minutes. All of what I've described related to the geopolitics of the area, and then when you kind of look inward and we see the chaos, the polarization in our society, the divisions in our society, the anger, the extreme inequality, economic and social inequalities in our society, a militarized police in our country, et cetera, et cetera. What I want to stress very strongly, if you see the decline of the American empire on a global level, it is also manifested domestically, okay? It is manifested domestically as well. So it's not a separate phenomenon. It's not by accident we have people like Trump that are potentially going to get elected again, okay? Or a Democratic Party that is not committed to the well-being of the country, but committed to permanent war and global hegemony, okay? So it's not by accident. Now, what has led us to this point? And one of the ironies of Trump and his what is Make America Great Again, I've always wondered, when was America great? Okay, because all I remember, it was always racist, and there was always a lot of poverty. And so on one level, Make America Great was when there were no Black and Hispanic and Asian people or women on TV in commercials. I guess when it was white, I guess that's what they were talking about. But in I kind of guess they're kind of thinking about the 50s, you know?
Yeah.
But that's when America was great. That's when most of us in this room were going through our formative, a lot of us in this room, not everybody, was going through our formative experiences. But why was America great in the 50s? First of all, it represented about 6% of the world's population and controlled about 50% of the world's markets and raw materials. But more important, It had a national development model that was committed to industrialization, which provided living wage jobs to the working class that were protected by unions with benefits, okay? Secondly, it was committed to the expansion of the public sector, okay? The rich paid beaucoup taxes and provided for the public sector. When I went to junior college in 1962, I paid $7.50 a semester. And when I came to Chico State in 1964, it was $47, okay? How much? I don't have any idea how much it costs today, okay? But it's outlandish, okay? We were driving through Chico today, and I said, I used to live there. It was $30 a month, you know? All that kind of stuff, you know? I know people that are, today somebody was gonna come here to hear the talk, and they said, I'm gonna have to help my son work on his applications. You know, he's going to a school that's gonna cost $65,000 a year. I mean, come on. I got an education for nothing. And it was the greatest education you could possibly get. I had Carl Hine and William Hutchins, old Hutch for teachers, okay? You know, I mean, how good can it be? So the deindustrialization, and then the neoliberal political agenda, smashing the public sector, education, etc. There's all kinds of reasons and why the thing is collapsing. But the point I want to make, it's the backside of the global story. It's not separate, okay? And my belief very strongly, it cannot be reformed. I do not believe it is reformed. It was reformable in the 30s and to some degree in the 60s, but it exhausted the New Deal liberal industrial model by the middle of the 60s. And the thing is, it cannot be reformed. So just hang on, you guys. And whatever you like to do it every day, okay? That's my view. Okay, I'm going to stop right now. Any rebuttals? Yes, please.
To kind of narrow down on how it benefits us to have Palestine destroyed.
Well, I think we talked about this before. It's okay. I don't need that anymore anyway. Okay. As we've said before, is that Israel is a white settler colony. And the Palestinians are the indigenous population. They are the Native Americans, okay? And all white settler colonies have the same mantra and the same structures, okay? And that is basically the dispossession of the land that the indigenous population was on. Secondly, a racist ideology to justify that, to make the indigenous people uncivilized, inhuman or subhuman, etc., and to create policies of genocide, okay? I mean, the U.S. did it. Who's surprised? It was done in Australia. The South Africans tried to do it.
How does the U.S. benefit? You mentioned the thing about...
Okay, that's point number one. The second point is that the history of Israel, the history of the Zionist project as adopted by the British during World War I was to help create a sub-imperialist, a Europeanized sub-imperialist entity in the Middle East that was surrounded by Arabs, Iranians, and Islamic populations. So Israel fundamentally has provided the role of a sub-imperial policeman in the region, okay? And it doesn't want to lose that. The third element of that is, and this is what is becoming transparent to anybody willing to look at it, and I was reading a book a couple nights ago about fascism in the United States, and it was part of it was a discussion about the alt-right. And one of the comments it said is the alt-right advocates that the Zionists control all of the political institutions. And obviously they counter to that. No, they don't. No, they don't. Look at what's going on now. It's proven. It's transparent. The Zionists control the United States. They control the political system. They control the White House. They control foreign policy. They can get rid of college presidents, okay? They can control boards of Harvard and Yale and Pennsylvania. They control the media, okay, etc. Okay, now it's obvious. I don't know if it's obvious. I am not anti-Semitic, but I am clearly anti-Zionist. And so when you wed those three elements together, it's very clear the role that Israel plays. Okay. Now the interesting thing is the debate that's been going on for many years: is Israel a client of the United States, or what we're learning now, maybe the United States is a client of Israel? Okay. You know, Israel isn't a proxy for the U.S. We're a proxy for Israel. Okay. And that's how interrelated the whole story is. Okay, and that's something that needs to be addressed domestically, because you related to the thrust of U.S. foreign policy and foreign policy objectives. Supporting Israel is in U.S. interest, but it is not in the interest of the American people by any stretch of the imagination. Okay. Any other comment or question to all of this? Yes.
One of your last points, you were talking about China's initiative, and I would think you were talking about the plan for the canal that's supposed to go through the Golan Heights. Is that what you were referencing?
Well, I didn't mention the canal, but I did mention the corridor,
Okay.
the trade corridor. Yeah, but there is another element too, and that was the so-called Ben Gurion Canal, which goes through the Gulf of Aqaba, through the Negev Desert, right through northern Gaza as well. Okay, now that's apparently been on the books for 20 or 30 years or so, and everything I've read about that in the last month or two is that is resurfaced as part of a structural alternative or future project to counter China's influence. But the point I've read is that there's really no money, seed money even for that. But the corridor was to be, that was to be put into place. Any other? Yeah.
Well, I would like, I know the Pope, I believe on the first day of this year, said that greed was the #1 sin of our society or the West or something like that. Did you read that? He made that pronouncement, sin, greed. And then when we ask about how and why or how do the Zionists control the United States, and does how does I'm asking you that now, because I think it's connected with greed.
Seems like money has a lot to do with it. Yeah. And being put into place in positions of influence as well. So, I mean, if you own a newspaper, I mean, you've got a lot of power. If you own
there you go, big time.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, where do we go to find our resource material for the takeover of our institutions by Zionists? I mean, do you have any books?
There's a couple books by James Petrus.
Uh-huh.
And to be very honest, I can't totally remember the titles. Both have Israel, militarism, United States in the title. And these are relatively older books, the last 20 years rather than the last 5 years, but they provide a framework that's very, very useful. That's James Petrus. Yeah.
But you can also Google Wolfowitz Doctrine, Brzezinski, the chessboard, PNAC. I don't remember what PNAC stands for.
Well, that was the Project for New American Century.
Yeah. Just look, I'm gonna look up PNAC because I think it's the Wolfowitz Doctrine with a couple of editions, and it's a policy paper written by Israel, which ends with a very interesting thought.
Which is?
the United States wouldn't be interested in doing any of these things if they didn't have a massive event.
If they didn't have a massive.
9/11.
9/11.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, I don't have enough accurate information, but the October 7th event is really, we don't know what happened October 7th, okay? There's all kinds of different views.
Well, we know enough that on October 7th, Netanyahu had ordered the military to stand down.
Yeah, we know that, yes.
He
yes.
also ordered this so-called public vending to be moved closer to Gaza 2 days before October 7th. And most of the people were killed, maybe the military, but they were in civilians, but they were still part of the military.
Right.
And there was nobody there at the gates when Hamas crossed the border,
Right.
or with minimal resistance.
What-
So there, you connect all the dots, it was like I'm on the,
I think,
I'm under the same time frame of what happened in 9/11.
I think John has answered the question. I agree with that very strongly, by the
Thank
way.
you for that.
But there's still, in my mind, some
It'll
hazy
come out.
stuff.
It'll
Yeah,
come out.
Yeah, like, for example, how many people were killed by the Israeli military versus how many were killed by Hamas? How many people were killed by non-Hamas people as well, okay? Because it wasn't just Hamas that came through those walls as well. So there's a lot of things that are still a little unclear in my mind. But I like 9/11. I mean, they knew it was going to happen. Let's put it that way. There's no debate in my mind.
Right.
You know. Yes.
Okay, Paige just mentioned the Project for the New American Century. Read that, everybody. You will see that that is our foreign policy now, period. And it has been apparently even before, it came out in 1998. Well, Iraq was the first to be toppled.
Right. Yeah.
And they're gonna end up, the last to be toppled, of 7 nations that were to be toppled, is Iran. And the other, Syria, Libya, were among the 7.
The axis of evil.
Among the 7 nations to be toppled.
Yeah. There are two lessons here. One, that whatever U.S. policy is publicly, it has been formulated behind the scenes. I mean, there's documents constantly laying out the outlines of U.S. foreign policy in all of this. I forgot what my second point was going to be. You had your hand up, or?
I just wanted to briefly touch on the greed bit.
Oh.
If you do a quick search of AIPAC, AIPAC, you will see that they endorse a number of our representatives in Congress and otherwise, and they consistently fund campaigns that are contra to generally candidates that the people of America are trying to support.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee.
You can also read about how it was formed and why it was formed.
Pardon?
The AIPAC, why and how it was formed back in the 80s with the Israeli invasion of South Lebanon.
Do you know that information?
I'm not comfortable enough with my knowledge about it to speak about it in public. It's very important to.
Yeah, I don't know enough to say anything publicly as well, but I will next time.
That-
Yes.
Yeah.
Could we go back to the corridor for a minute?
Yes.
Were you talking about an economic, political corridor?
Okay.
And would you tell me again where that corridor is and how it ends in Gaza?
It's a trade corridor related to rail, shipping, and then rail, and then shipping. Okay, from India through Saudi Arabia into Israel, through northern Gaza, and then I think it was to Pyrrhus, the port of Athens' port in Greece. Ironically, built and owned by the Chinese, by the way. So there were some real problems there, by the way, in getting
What is
cooperation.
owned by the Chinese?
The port in Epirus, the Athenian port, but that was going to be the terminus for this.
That's
corridor.
delightful.
I know. It's the irony. I mean, the irony. The tragedy of the world is that we don't cooperate and share, and we don't we shouldn't be fighting. I mean, I sound like an idiot here talking about this kind of stuff, but it's amazing. Any other questions, comments? Yes. Lucy?
Okay, no,
Yes.
just today, I read something that Biden's point person for dealing with the Israeli situation right now is Brett McCurk. And that deal with Saudi Arabia, this is I don't know how you describe the present administration. They still think they can get the deal with Saudi Arabia to work with Israel with the idea that Saudi Arabia will rebuild Gaza.
Yeah.
In any case, that is still the going philosophy within the Biden administration.
Well, I think that's the delusional nature of most of U.S. policy at this point. I mean, related to Ukraine, almost every week you hear something about rebuilding Ukraine, or the European. When we rebuild Ukraine, you're not going to rebuild Ukraine. China's going to rebuild Ukraine. Okay, if Ukraine is going to be rebuilt at all, they parts of reality just are not part of their formulation. Okay, and part of delusion is not wanting to face reality, the truth. Okay, that the U.S. is in decline and they're losing. Okay. And it's time to reckon with this. But these are cowboys that are just not going to give up, Yeah. I don't see any more questions. I want to say about greed, okay, real quick. I like the Pope, okay? I grew up as a Roman Catholic, and he's one of my favorite popes of all time.
Me too.
Pope John the 23rd is still my favorite pope. He screwed the church up because it was no longer in Latin, now it's in English. So it's not as cool now. Hic, hoc, host,
Is he cool with population control?
I don't know. I can't answer that. Okay. Related.
Let's check him out on that.
Let's check him out. Right on. Thank you. The thing about greed is real, but it's really capitalism. Okay, it's really about capitalism and about the imperative to accumulate wealth, okay, and it's the analogy that I think of is, you guys ever seen the Beatles movie, The Yellow Submarine?
Yeah.
Remember that little fish that had a vacuum cleaner for a nose, and it went around and sucked up all the other fish, and then all of a sudden the fish were all gone, and then it started sucking up all the water, and then all of a sudden the water was gone. And then it turned on its ass and sucked itself up. That's capitalism, okay? It has to. And what is very important, we're talking about the European, absolute global hegemony and all this kind of stuff. It feeds the arms industry and all this kind of stuff, the think tanks and all this kind of stuff. But it's really about having access to new markets, new raw materials, and new strategic advantages, etc. It's still about raping the world. And then you would wonder about Europe. Why would Europe commit economic and political suicide aligning with U.S. policy towards Russia, okay? And the way to answer that is, again, it's not necessarily the population, although I just spent a month in Berlin last summer, and everywhere you went are Ukrainian flags everywhere, okay? And it's kind of scary and weird, to be honest with you. But it's the ruling classes and their political establishment. But what they've thought of, how they operate, is the U.S. is the big guy, and we're going to align with the U.S., and then we'll defeat Russia, and then we will divvy up the pie amongst us, okay? I think we've made this comment before, but the 1884-1885 Berlin Conference, where the imperialist powers met under Bismarck, and they figuratively had a blank map of Africa, and they just drew lines on Africa, okay? The Germans can have this part, the French can have this part, the English can have this part, the Portuguese, you already got Angola and Mozambique, and so you can have the resources there. That's what this lineup is about, okay? That's what the G7 and all that. We're gonna work together militarily, we'll go bomb Yemen together, etc. And when it's all over, we will have pieces of the pie, okay? So it's still about capitalism, okay? And the control of the world's markets and raw materials. So greed is one way to describe it, but it's deeper than greed, okay? Because when it comes to lemon meringue pie, I'm greedy, okay? Okay, as well. One more comment, yes.
Well, I just have to throw in a pitch from the geographers.
Okay.
If you want to see an interesting series of documentaries on Prime, Rise of the Continents. And two things you gotta impress in your brain. When before Columbus, all of the resources, and particularly what the trade was, gold, and to some extent when the Indian continent was the international trade unit, it was gold and silver. When you get west of the former Soviet Union, Germany and North America, our resources are very limited. In fact, North America doesn't have much anymore. Virtually all the important resources in the world are in the continent, which is the Soviet Union, because remember that broke off of Africa, and the continent of Africa, period. There's more oil in the Caspian Basin than any place else in the world. And it's about resources. And certainly, and those three geographers, Mackinder, there was a geographer that took after Mackinder who advised Hitler. He advised him to go to Stalingrad and get the oil resources, because the only oil resources that these geographers knew about were in Central Asia and the Middle East. And that was a slight mistake on Hitler's part to go to Stalingrad. So remember, it's the resources.
Yeah, there was a Princeton.
I mean, we don't have any natural gas. It comes out of Azerbaijan and.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me add some room. Yeah,
There's a Princeton professor who says, when you're looking at wars or beginnings of wars or rumblings about war, she says, look under the ground.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly what you're saying.
This is my last comment. What's interesting historically is that, remember where Columbus was headed? He was trying to get to China, okay? Because that was all the wealth and trade and goods and all that kind of stuff. And then in fact, Western Europe was a periphery of the Chinese Indian centric Eurasian trading system, okay? And so when there's contact with the Americas, now quickly the gold and silver from the Americans are going to create wealth in Western Europe. And so the center of the new global world system is now Western Europe. And then when you look at the history of the last 400 or 500 years, the center of that system, the core of that system, moved from Lisbon to Madrid to Amsterdam to London to New York, and now it's moving back to Beijing, okay? It's going full circle. And when you look at it that way, it's a very fascinating dynamic, okay? Okay, because the key to the core, here's a truism of hegemony. And you can use this with any hegemonic state. The advantage of hegemony, and you have hegemony because you have economic supremacy, production, technological supremacy, the military supremacy. Your currency is the dominant currency of the world, and you have legitimacy, okay? Remind me to comment on legitimacy in a minute related to Gaza. And so you have that, And that gives you the advantage of having markets and access to resources outside of the nation state, which means you have to have a military to police and control those resources, which means there's going to be wars on the peripheries of that system, which means you begin, the people who are wealthy begin to get more wealth from the periphery than from the original plant that it had in the first place, okay? So what happens, it begins to no longer, it doesn't reinvest in the domestic plant that gave it the hegemony in the first place, okay? And then what happens is the rise of one or more competitor states who now have more advanced production methods or technologies, and then you have a fault line of competition, rivalry and war, regional war, peripheral wars, and then a world war. You guys see the analogy that I'm talking about? That's exactly where the United States is at this point. Now, related to legitimacy, part of hegemony is not just military power or economic power, it is also your legitimacy, okay? That is that people either consensually agree with you and are linked to your project, I just mentioned the G7, or they respect you and admire you because of your culture or your jazz or your movies or whatever, or they're scared shitless of you, okay? Okay, for obvious reasons, okay? What is happening with Gaza, the US was already in decline, but in the area of legitimacy, the US has exponentially lost its legitimacy on a global level. Okay, for example, Israel. Israel prevailed related to its legitimacy, partly because its ideology and its soft power controlling information, but also because countries were scared to death of it, okay? Hamas blew that out of the water, okay? And now that respect, and I think I said this in my last talk, part of the vengeance of the Israeli government in its striking with Gaza is they were so humiliated. Finkelstein talked about this the other day in some YouTube video as well. They were so humiliated because, you know, how dare these subhuman people outwit us, okay? I'm serious. And so part of that vengeance is that. But they'll never regain that legitimacy. The fear, no, you think the Houthis are afraid of Israel? No way, no way. And certainly the US's legitimacy related to, defending human rights and all this kind of stuff, it's out the window. So when you begin to lose legitimacy, your power begins to exponentially decline. And that's another thing about Gaza that is very, very fascinating. Lucy, you did have a comment.
Oh, yeah, because, you have friends in Germany.
Yes.
How are they accepting being so submissive to the United States?
Yeah. They don't like it. My friends don't like it at all. Yeah. I'm going to stop, you guys. And I assume we can do this in February again?